Hello, welcome back to another pen talk. Thanks for tuning in. You may recognize the pen in front of you as the PENBBS 308 Cloud Sky Crystal. I love my viewers, and someone gave me a link to a phenomenal document that a person put together showing all the numbers of the PENBBS pens and their associated colors with some interesting photography to go with it. So I mean, that's great. So I need to actually determine what number this one is, but we're not here to talk about the pen in particular. We're here to talk about the nib that's in the pen. So I do like having nibs ground. I've worked with a couple of nib meisters, some of the more famous ones in our area. So I found a new person, Mike. I bought a Jinhao 992 that he ground, and I really enjoyed it. So I've been working with him on other nib grinds, and we've been going back and forth, and I send him nibs to grind, and he sends them back. And so this is an example of some of those grinds that he's done for me. He ground a PENBBS nib, which we're going to take a look at. And we're going to use this pen for all of them. Originally, I had this pen eyedroppered. I'm doing the intro last, which is out of order, but I originally was going to put this into my anniversary video, but then that anniversary video would have been much too long, and it really didn't fit into the flow that I would looking for in that video. So therefore, we extracted out the nib part of it, and that's what this video became. So I did eyedropper this with Lamy Turquoise. I wasn't happy with how it worked, and then went to Robert Oster Frankly Blue, and that's one of the things that, you know, nibs and inks and feeds and all of those things, sometimes you get combinations which don't quite work, and it's not exactly apparent a lot of times. You think maybe there's something else going on. Did I clean it good? You know, when I have nibs ground, I wash them in ammonia and soap before I do anything with the nibs, just like I flush my pens when I get new pens. That's just the way that I am. There's no sense in taking a risk, whether it's necessary or not. It only takes a few seconds to do, and it avoids that inking up a pen and going to write with it and go, what's happening? I don't know. So that's kind of the key thing. So that's the intro. I like this pen. And I figured I'd use the black background. You can see I have inky fingers because I've been swapping nibs hot. And you do get ink. And every time I swapped the nib, I needed to reprime the feed, make certain everything was back and normal, because you really disrupt that environment inside of the feed that has that ink flow from the converter through the feed to the nib and then to the paper. So if you get any air in that, and there's a gentleman who did a really excellent review on air in converters. So I'll put a link to that in case nobody's ever seen it, because I don't have a lot of views, but it's very, very well done, and it really gives you some nice ways of looking at different things. So now that I'm thinking about that more than I thought about it before, I got to make certain that that ink is continuous from converter through the feed to the nib. So you'll see some examples in the upcoming video, in this video, of where that I didn't take care and watch what was going on, and you can see the results. So let's dive right in and let's take a look at some ground nibs. In keeping with the Year of the Nib theme, here we have two PENBBS nibs. The one on the left is the normal one that you get with the pen, and the one on the right has been ground by Mike. He put a little bit of a character to it, took off a little bit of that tipping material, made the nib a little narrower. You know, even though it's labeled as a fine, it's really a fine medium. So this shows how that tipping material has been removed, and the grind. The feeds are good on these pens, so hopefully that's not going to be any issue with that keeping up. But, you know, I enjoy experimenting and trying different things, and you can look at the nib and the grind and you don't really know how it's going to write, but that's why it's fun for me. So we're going to ink this up and put nib to paper and see what these changes are that Mike did. I use silicone grease on all internal threads, especially something like this where I'm going to eyedropper it and there's a nice O-ring there. I'm generous with my silicone grease. I don't see any downside to it. And we certainly want to make certain that the seal is good when we do the eyedroppering. And this also makes putting that in and out of the barrel easier. It slides on that grease. So an ink to put in the PENBBS cloud that I'm going to eyedropper is this. So I've enjoyed this ink a lot before, and with the kind of wet, which I'm expecting, flow, we're going to use this syringe. We're going to fill it up. I'm going to write with it for a little bit, and then we'll show you the writing samples. So here's the pen filled up, and I have to admit that that color in this acrylic is just amazing. I mean, it really does change the look of the pen substantially. You can see that demarcation between here is a, you know, solid acrylic, and then here is where the ink starts and goes all the way through there. I mean, I'm impressed. The only thing that, you know, it kind of maybe detracts a little bit from the look of the pen, because this is a very nice look. So, you know, I'm not certain I'm going to keep it this way, but at least I'm glad I gave this a shot. As you can see, the ink has worked its way down. So it's certainly something different, which is good to try. But let's see if it's something we want to keep. Here we have the pen. As you can see, I've removed the ink, not using this as an eyedropper any longer. I wasn't happy with how the Lamy turquoise worked with this ground nib and the feed and everything else. It just didn't have the flow that I thought was important for that ink, and I didn't like the way the nib worked with that ink, so flushed it out. Thankfully, it returned to its clear nature after that. I have a converter in here which has that black end to it, so that's why you see a little bit of that in the pen, but it cleaned out cleanly. So thankfully the Lamy turquoise and this resin did not react at all, so that was nice. So now I've filled it up with Robert Oster Frankly Blue, which is a little bit more denser ink, and I think it works a little bit better. I mean, this definitely lays down a darker line of ink. This is a grind I'm having challenges adjusting to. Yeah, it's a little bit finer in this horizontal than it was with the original PENBBS. The verticals are a little bit wider, but not much, a little bit more flow, which is what you would expect. So overall, it doesn't add as much character as I'd hoped to it. It is different. It is interesting. So I've been on a roll with Mike, and this is the first one he's ground for me that didn't exactly come out the way I thought, but I just told him to take a chance at it. There's still a little bit of an upturn there at the base, but not much. You know, so part of the thing when you experiment with grinding on nibs and everything else, you're going to have some losers, but, you know, I'll take all the winners that I've gotten, and the ones that don't work out quite as well, well, that's something you learn from, and that's the feedback that you get if you work with a Nibmeister. Hopefully, if you get a chance to do it at a pen show or other means, is when you sit down with them, you write with the pen, you talk to them about what you would like the nib to do, and they do some grinding on it, give it to you, you write with it, you go back and forth until the nib finally is in the place where you feel comfortable with it and you like it. So I really do think this ink works better in this pen than the Lamy turquoise did. But let's take a look at how another nib might write. Before we go to another nib, here's just a standard nib that hasn't been ground. So here's your horizontals. As you can see, they're slightly wider, I'd say about 50% wider. And here's your verticals, which are about the same, not quite, so you're a little bit wider up here. So the variations between horizontal and vertical are increased because of this grind. So it's one of the things that gave you, but this just glides across the paper. This type of grind requires a little bit more effort, a little bit more attention to the angle and how the nib is on the paper, but it's nice how you're getting a little bit of shading there that I think is really nice. So this ink is, I think it's the Winter Blue from Krishna, so yeah, I haven't seen a lot of shading with that ink. So when I got my Fantasy 308, Bobby included a generic medium nib. Yes, it says iridium point JPL, and I'm certain there's no iridium in it, but it's just like Xerox copy and Kleenex and other things. Iridium point has become just a branding label, not necessarily a description of the material used, just basically showing that there is a point on this nib that touches the paper that's different than the rest of the nib. So let's see how this pen performs. So you all know that I like the standard nib that comes with the PENBBS. It's a fine. This is definitely not a fine. Now this was a result of me swapping nibs hot. I pulled out the ground nib and put in this one. And eventually whatever ink was in here created an air bubble with what was in the cartridge, the converter. So now I've reprimed it, got rid of that air, and we have the flow that we expect on this nib. And this is a gusher. I mean, that's just an amazing amount of ink. This is Robert Oster Frankly Blue. So I have to admit that, again, I'm impressed that Bobby came up with this nib. It fits easily in the PENBBS feed and section. And this is one of those pens that it's easy to pull out the nib, unlike some of the pens that you can't pull out the nib on. So overall, I'm impressed. You know, this is phenomenally smooth. Takes no effort to write. And that is an amazing amount of ink flow. I've always known these PENBBS feeds could do that because I've had broads on here, double broads, you know, italic nibs and things like that, and the flow is always kept up very well with the nib. Looks like that nib is a little bit off center, but it doesn't affect the way that it writes. So we're almost halfway through. We are halfway through. We're in the 6th month of the year, so July 1st represents halfway through. So the year of the nib continues to be a great experiment. Too bad I can't write better. So I'm impressed. I'll see if we can find this nib on any auctions that Bobby has, and if not, I'll encourage him to offer it. And if you see one of his PENBBS pens for sale with an extra medium nib, you know it writes well. Here we are with 3 nibs. 2 PENBBSs on the left. The one on the far left has been ground. The one in the middle is the standard one. And the one on the right is a Jinhao nib that Mike included in a bunch of nibs I had ground by him. And that looks like a really nice left oblique, which I'm a fan of. So let's see how this nib performs on paper. Same ink, just did a hot swap. And we can be ready to write. I mean, I really enjoy this nib quite a bit. This to me is what I like with, I'm going to call it a left oblique. And that just fits my writing style. I usually have no trouble using this type of nib to write with, and it gives some nice natural line variation. And this just, it glides. Requires no pressure to write. That's about as light as pressure as I can put on it. And you still get a nice line variation between horizontal and vertical. And this puts down a really good patch, which is what I tend to expect from my PENBBS pens, regardless of what nib I put in them. And that Frankly Blue is Frankly Blue. So hopefully you've enjoyed this little experiment, swapping nibs, trying different things, having nibs that were ground by a Nibmeister. So we've reached the end. So thank you for watching. May you have many great writing experiences. This is a phenomenal variations of different experiences of nib on paper. So we've reached the end of this video. Until next time, bye.